Welcome to The Collective Voice, a podcast that amplifies issues affecting technical hiring. The Collective Voice is brought to you by eTeki, a technical interviews as a service platform which helps hiring teams focus resources on the most qualified people for IT roles. This episode is the third in the series on diversity and inclusion. In this podcast, Recruiting Daily President William Tincup talks to Ashish Kaushal, founder of Consciously Unbiased and CEO of Hire Talent, a minority business enterprise, an MBE workforce solutions firm. I'm Amanda Cole, Vice President of eTeki, and I'm so grateful you're listening.
And I grew in a very homogeneous town, so basically I was the only brown kid in my high school. At least for the first 2 years. In the third year, we had my next door neighbor who's a family friend ended up moving there too. So there were two brown people, and then we had one black kid there. Everyone else was white. And so growing up, I didn't feel any discrimination, but my friends' parents liked me. They would say I was white to fit the box that they liked, right? And it's what they knew. There's nothing offensive about it or anything. It's just like relate to who you know, right?
Right.
And so when I went to college, I went to RPI, and there's all these people from different walks of life and socioeconomic, cultural, religious backgrounds. And so I really felt like I grew at that point and really got to see what's out there and sort of learn from other people's life experiences and cultures and things like that. So it was really a passion of mine. So then when I went as an intern, I interned at Aetna, and one of the things I started when I was there is we did weekly lunches that were of a different culture, and someone would take the lead on that. And so we tried Japanese food and all those other different types of foods, and so I really exposed myself to other cuisines as well. And then when I graduated college, I went to Accenture, worked there for 2 years in their emerging media group, and so I got to travel in the country and also to Europe and Asia, doing projects for them and stuff like that. And so when I left there, I joined the Internet Incubator, where the idea was to have a venture fund and invest in startups that were going to basically go public in the dot-com economy back in 97, 99. And then 2000 hit and the economy collapsed. But in that period, I was taking on leadership roles in various organizations that we were building and in these agencies. And so when that economy collapsed, I was like, forget the dot-com billion-dollar idea. Let me just build a cash flow positive business. And I was working with all these agencies. I felt like throwing paper against the wall instead of actually vetting candidates and creating more work for me. So I decided to build our own company. And when I started building it, I wanted to make sure we had diversity of thought. And what I mean by that is you and I may look different, but if we both grew up in the same Midwest town and had the same middle-class sort of background, even though there's slight differences, we'd ultimately have the same thought process, right? And so I wanted to make sure we had people from different socioeconomic, cultural, sexual orientation, religious backgrounds. We built the organization and learn a way to sort of have differing ideas, but communicate in a way that relates to each other, and so that we can look at different people's perspectives without just pushing over them. And so that's kind of what we built, and as a net result, people still relate to people who they relate to, and so that indirectly ended up making us build a pipeline of diverse talent where to this day we basically fill about 80% of our fills are from diverse talent for our clients. So it's pretty cool. And so and before I go into Consciously Unbiased, I want to ask you, what does that phrase say to you?
Well, consciously, for me at least, means purposely. It's thoughtful. It's not something that happens haphazardly. So the first part of it is, if we dissect the two words, I would dissect the first word as something that you've purposely, thoughtfully, consciously thought of doing something. Like if we were walking down the road, I had to learn how to walk again after a car accident. I was consciously thinking about step after step. Whereas before the accident, I wouldn't have thought about that. It would have been something that subconsciously would have happened. So the first of it is pretty easy. The bias, unbiased. It's again, you're trying to rid the world of some of the things that plague all of us. in that is that we all have biases. We all can fall victim to those biases and stereotypes, and get into bigotry and homophobia and xenophobia and sexist and all kinds of rabbit holes. But the point is we're all littered with biases. It's a question of, are you in touch with your bias, and can you limit your bias as best you can? And so the first half is you're purposely thinking about doing something. The second is that what you're purposely trying to do is reduce, is probably the best thing that I'd say, bias, by trying to make things as unbiased as humanly possible. So how close am I?
So, so the way this kind of organization came together was a few different things. Like, one was, so we, like I said, we mostly do diversity staffing, right? And so we help our clients find diverse candidates, and everyone has a goal of like moving the needle on diversity, but then to actually do anything about it, right? And so you can bring a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink it. And so I started thinking about that on a Sunday, and then I started thinking about, we're so polarized right now that the left can't see the right, and the right can't see what the left thing, right? We're talking past each other, right? And part of that is because we're focusing on our differences rather than our commonalities, right?
Mm-hmm.
The third thing was, if you look at biases are really based on life experiences, right? And so I started thinking about the term unconscious bias, and it would drive me nuts because of two things. One is, we honestly probably know between 70 and 80% of our biases, right? And then 30%, 20 to 30% we don't know. And so you go through this training on unconscious bias, it's basically saying, I know what I know, I didn't know what I didn't know, but because I didn't know what I didn't know, I can keep doing what I'm doing.
Right.
Because you're providing cover. And then number two is, you're making biases. So if you think about biases, they're based on life experiences, right? And so it defines who you are as a person. And so if you make people feel bad about, during their diversity training, about their biases, then how are you going to get them to actually change what they do?
Right. Agreed.
So biases define who we are. And then the third thing was diversity in this polarizing environment is turned into a bad word, and we're all victims, right? And so I was like, okay, so how do we make this a positive thing? So I said, all right, if we own our biases and that defines who we are, now it's a matter, and so we wear a crowd, and then ones we don't know, we learn about, right? And if we can acknowledge those two things, and if we realize that it's just a matter of applying those biases in the right situations,
right,
and taking control, right? And so, so that was kind of where the thought process came from. And then I started thinking about discrimination. And if you think about discrimination, like, what do you think the root cause of that is?
Well, there's a lot of root causes. I mean, at least it's been documented. It's a combination of biases, life experiences, fear, bad experiences.
So you hit on it. You hit on it right there. So that's what I was looking for. So if you think about biases, and the reason, like, I may not want to meet a person who's transgender, right, is because I'm afraid of what they're like, and I don't know them. They're the unknown, right? And so I think biases actually get fixed if you can get this. So there's two sides of the equation, right? There's biases and there's curiosity, right? And so people who are super curious in life overcome biases because they're curious. The curiosity overcomes their resistance to change or experiencing or discovering things. And so if you can feed the curiosity part of your brain, I think you can actually overcome biases as a result. And it was funny, I was watching, I forget the name of the show, but it was on MSNBC, and it was about this guy who used to be what's that term called for people who hate black people?
Racist?
Yeah, not racist, but like the KKK kind of. Like, he was one of the KKK people,
okay.
right? And
yeah.
And he ended up being a leader in that organization, and he ended up like accidentally getting exposed to somebody of a different race, and over time he learned that basically the reason he started all this stuff is because of the fear of when he was growing up, and he was an outsider because he came from Italy and he was considered an outsider to his community, and so these guys kind of preyed on his fears and basically pulled him in, and now he's made it his life goal to sort of change people's biases, right?
Well,
and
I think I like both sides of the curiosity and fear. What I like about that is you're basically saying with exposure, you can reduce fear by basically shining a light in the darkness and making fear. You can reduce it. With curiosity, it's the same thing. The person's got to want to, then they make some actions, and then their exposure. It doesn't necessarily guarantee success. I mean, hate on them anymore.
Absolutely.
Right.
So it's redefining your assumptions, right?
That's You're almost kind of, you have to have that experience. It's nice that you said that this is all nurture and not nature. There's nothing genetic about making a white supremacist. It's a learned behavior, or behaviors plural. I think some would argue with that. But I like the fact that you take a hard stand on it. I love both the curiosity and fear factor, reducing or minimalizing, exposing. If we had that exposure, and you've also in very quick, short order, you've opened up diversity in many different ways. You know, like you started with, hey, Midwestern. We're both from Iowa. We've both grown up in the kind of same town. We've had the same experiences. You could be black, I could be, Jewish or whatever. But essentially, we're the same because we've had a lot of the same life experiences. There's other ways to cut that, right? There's other ways to slice diversity. What do you? What are some of your favorites?
So that's kind of an interesting question. So basically, when we came up with this shirt, right? And I said, let's try it out and see what kind of reaction we get. And I want to see the conversations, because nothing changes if you don't have conversations, right? So let's just start the conversation. So we put up the T-shirt that was a skin tone color one with no one in it in a picture, and I put it up on LinkedIn and said coming soon. And I have about 30,000 followers on LinkedIn, so I get a reaction from somebody. Right? So this guy from the South basically wrote, I don't agree with this. This is reverse discrimination. Why are you using LinkedIn as a political platform? So I took down his post and said, hey, can I call you? And he goes, sure. So I started calling him. I call him. We start talking for a few minutes. I noticed he has a Southern accent. So I said, are you originally from Texas? And he goes, yes, born and raised. And he says it proud. So in my head, I'm like, okay, now I got to pull him in rather than and associate to him rather than try to push over him and say, this is why your thought process may not be accurate, right? And so I asked him if he owned a flannel shirt. He goes, I do. I'm like, that's amazing, because I own 7 of them because I live in New York City, because it gets cold in the winter, so I like the way they look. They hang on, they keep me warm. And he's like, that's cool. And so now we're relating, right? And so then I go, as you know, we're a New York-based staffing company, so we work a lot of investment banks. And he goes, that makes sense. And I said, great. So I said, humor me for a second, but let's assume you have a double PhD from Caltech in applied math and economics. Do you think you'd make a good investment banking candidate? And notice I start saying it faster, right? And he goes, yeah, I think so. I go, great. I go, do you think you run circles on him? He starts thinking about it. He's like, yeah, hell yeah, actually. With that degree, with those degrees, absolutely. I'm like, okay, so let's fast forward. I get you an interview, show up with your Southern accent, your flannel t-shirt, and your flannel shirt, and your 2 PhD degrees. What do you think they're going to assume about you? He goes dead quiet. And then I go, look, I'm not trying to place all brown people in jobs. I go, no one has a monopoly on discrimination, right? You could, right. I go, biases are based on life experiences. And I go, here's the second life experience, or here's a second example of bias. You see a guy, you guys have an open gun law in Texas, right? He goes, yeah. I go, you see a guy walking down the street with a gun out. He may or may not shoot you, but your best judgment is to walk on the other side of the street and avoid the whole situation, right? He goes, yes. I go, so basically that's what it is. It's about like knowing when to apply the biases in the right situation. So I said, you may have missed out on your best friends. They could have met at a restaurant or bar because you judged how they looked or how they spoke instead of who they are. And you may miss out on a great hire, just like I put you in this discriminating situation where you judged how they spoke or what they wore rather than what their skills are and what they can do.
Right.
And then he was like, I'm so sorry I misjudged this. I go, no, dude, this is what it's about. It's about the conversation. I go, if we focus on our commonalities and our differences and realize that everyone, white, black, green, red, orange, can have discrimination happen to them, right?
That's right. That's right. It's interesting because most of this century has been about race and gender. Yeah. And having empathy to kind of see it from the other person's perspective. How do you have this conversation with somebody that maybe not gets it at first? So how do you break somebody down especially on the staffing side, when you're trying to help them. Yes, we're trying to increase our D&I. We care deeply about diversity and inclusion, and then you go in and say, fantastic. And there's a glazed look. They have no idea what you're talking about. What do you do then?
Yeah, I mean, so think about that question. So you have kids. Do you have kids?
I do. 13 and 9, two boys.
And so when you say this is important to us, we're going to eat healthy for the next year, like, and do they buy into it, or are they eating candy on the side?
Right. Well, with me, they're eating candy on the side, but yes.
Right. So you might have a stated goal as management or as a parent, right? But that doesn't mean that your team's going to follow what you're saying, or that it's important to them, and because you haven't made the case to make it important to them, right? And so it's one thing for management to say we want to get to X amount of diversity hires in a year, right? But if you're training to get your team to actually buy into the vision and implement it isn't there, then you're kind of, it's like your kid asking for a transformer and just crying about it but not doing anything to like make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I think the idea around this is like, one is if you can convince people, like I gave you the Texas story where I put him in a situation where it could happen to him, so now it's important to him, right?
Right.
Or if you put him in a situation where it can happen to somebody you love, then it might be important to him. So right now the problem with diversity training right now is that management says this is important to you, but if you think about it, like, did your kids go to church growing up?
They did and do.
And do they love it?
Yeah, they actually do.
From the age of 2 and 10?
Believe it or not, yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I went to, my dad's very religious, so when I went to church or religious activities growing up, I went there because my parents forced me to. I liked it because my friends were there, so it was a social thing for me. The messaging that the priest gave was the same message he gave a 7-year-old as a 5-year-old. And as a 5-year-old, it didn't resonate, right?
Right.
And so the training right now, you're going there because your manager forces you to, which is like your parent. You show up there, the messaging is not resonating to you because it's not personal to you or somebody you love, right? And so while you're there, you basically like, you may enjoy it because you're catching up with coworkers, or you're ignoring it completely and just looking at your emails, right? And so at the end, when you walk away, now your manager is saying that this is important, you try to educate them on why it's important, and you bring candidates into the pipeline, but it's not important to the guy who's actually making the decision.
Mm-hmm. How similar do you see this as to what we used to do in sexual harassment training?
So I have not that educated with that side of it.
It's similar. It's similar. I can answer it for you, of course. This was the similar thing that happened in the 80s and 90s was that leadership would say sexual harassment is a bad thing. We need training. Everyone needs to get better at this. We can't allow it. And of course, people, mostly men, took those training courses, didn't really pay attention to the training, and really did whatever the hell they wanted to, and thus, a lot of bad behaviors still happen. So it is extremely similar in that there's a separation between words and actions, right? And you can say something's important, but until you actually do something, it's not really that important.
Yeah.
So how important is it from the top down to be doing something about it? When you go in and you talk to, your clients, how important is it for you to get executive buy-in?
Oh, you absolutely have to have executive buy-in, but you also have to lead by example. So you have to, your diversity panel has to be representing the population you want to have today, or the one that you represent today, right? So to get people to buy in, if you're just saying I want this and executive buy-in is there, but they don't lead by example by actually building their team that way, I don't think it's going to really resonate down the pipeline.
Well, let's try that. Let's try it. Let's walk that dog. If it's aspirational, okay, so you recognize that you have a problem, right? So it's 5 white, pear-shaped, middle-aged, salt and pepper, haired men that say we want to be more diverse. Now, looking at them, they're not diverse. But if it's aspirational and they're willing to put something behind it, then can't they change? Right?
Yep.
But they've got to recognize, to your point earlier, you've got to be able to look in the mirror and say, yeah, this isn't right, this is off, we've got to change. Is there a business case for D&I?
There is. So I think it's on multiple levels. But so I also think, like, if you look at let's say, like, right now it's good business sense to actually do D&I, right? Because it's popular. If you're selling to a demographic, if you don't understand what they really want, then you're gonna have trouble building products for them, right?
Right.
So there's direct ROI there. And then if you look at, like, even Nike, right? Nike did what was right, and what was right actually moved their stock value up a few $1 billion with their ad, right? And they took a risk, but they did what they felt was good. And I think in this political environment, it's interesting because corporations are being forced to stop sitting on the sidelines and being neutral. They have to actually make a bet and say, this is right, this is wrong, and this is what we're going to do. And if they don't, they're starting to get, with the millennial population, they're starting to get pushed to the sidelines, right? So they have a choice. If they want, this generation isn't just about collecting a paycheck, or isn't just about wearing a certain brand. It's about wanting to make sure that they contribute to society in a meaningful way. So if you're not living and breathing those values, I think you're kind of in trouble.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. What's the relationship that you've seen between D&I initiatives and values or culture?
Oh, I think they're totally related, right?
It seems it seems, especially in recruiting, it seems especially so with recruiting younger generations, millennials and Gen Z. I'm not so sure that it matters with Gen X or Boomers as much. I could be biased there, but the values and culture, again, if you've got to as you recruit younger talent, you've got to not only be able to tell them a story, be able to prove to them and show them, the social good, what's actually really happening, or they don't believe you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Healthy skepticism. So my business case for D&I goes a little bit like this, and I want you to tear it apart. Diversity creates conflict. Conflict creates innovation. Innovation creates market share.
Mm-hmm.
So I go from one to the other in a very simple terms. I go deeper, but basically, diverse things, there's friction. If you have the same five, pear-shaped white guys, if they all went to Stanford, undergrad and Stanford, MBA, they all have, they all have wives that kind of get along. They're all with the same golf, country club. They all live in the same area. They all have about the same age kids. Like, it's got to be really easy in that company because they can finish each other's sentences. Like, they're so alike, and it's got to be easy. Problem is because it's so easy, they probably don't innovate as frequently as they should.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy. So on one level, these differences that we talk about, diversity and inclusion, by including all these, we're actually forcing some conflict. And in that conflict, good things come out of that conflict. To your point, the curiosities get met, fear gets reduced, people get to understand each other, but also there's innovation that comes out of that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Nepotism and cronyism are, especially, you nailed it when you said if they can't do the job, like they don't have the capabilities, but they get the job, then everything falls apart.
Yep.
And I think that's where we tackle the elitism, cronyism, and even privilege. Is we just basically say if you have the chops and you can do the job, well, it doesn't matter where you come from. But if you can't do the job, meaning it's based on your performance, it's based on the outcomes, it's based on meritocracy, the best person doing the job. While I got you here, what do you think of affirmative action?
About what?
Affirmative action.
I mean, I think it's needed if applied right. It shouldn't be done for the sake of being done, right? Like, you shouldn't say, I need to hire a brown person, so let's just make it happen even if they don't have the skills, right? But on the flip side, I think you should invest in people if they're not traditionally in that. It's also an untapped market, right? So women in technology, there's not enough women in technology, and we're finding that they're actually probably really good at certain things, like, for example, multitasking, right? They're genetically better in certain things, or maybe not, but whatever the reason is, you should invest the dollars in sort of building that population to see if it works, right? That's the whole point of evolving. And like you said in the beginning about curiosity, the way innovation happens is if you push the needle and break boundaries on what's traditionally known as people are good at one thing versus the other, you might get an invention that you didn't realize because you invested in these people.
Right. Yeah, I take that's actually a very, very good view. I take a kind of a harder stance. I think it should have been, 2 or 3 generations and then expire. Like, it shouldn't be something that just goes on forever and for perpetuity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It just, my personal belief, and again, American Indian, so I have a whole lot of biases, mostly about immigrants. No, I'm just kidding. It's to me, it should have expired. Kind of like the Constitution. I look at the U.S. Constitution and say, you know what? Every 25 years, you should revise it. Be forced to revise it so that it's an active, moving thing. So affirmative action, while it made a hell of a lot of sense in the 60s, I'm not so sure it makes sense now. And in fact, a lot of the African-American guys and gals that I know hate it. They despise it because it's like, why? I don't need a handout. I'll win based on my performance. I don't need that. But anyhow, we digress.
But I'm not sure it's a handout because you still have to be able to deliver the the value, right? If you're just getting it because you're a certain ethnic.
Do you?
Yeah, I believe so.
I'm not so sure. It's been in my experience that if you're hiring on quotas, you're not hiring necessarily on performance. That the person doesn't necessarily have to do the job. That doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, right? That's where people's arguments are. Absolutely. That is definitely not mutually exclusive. All right, I gotta get your take on regionalism. Like, what do you think we have one, America, or is there 15 or 16 different Americas? Like, what's your bid on regionalism, and especially from a staffing perspective?
Wait, sorry, say that one more time.
Regionalism. Like, do you believe that we're all 50 states are similar? Are they the same? Are we really a United States of America, or is there regionalism, and if so, does that feed into particular biases?
Oh, absolutely. I do think we're all one United States, but I think that it's just like culture, right? You can even take a city and break it down by ethnicity and culture and religion and all that stuff, right? So everyone has their own little take on it and different views and stuff, and everyone judges each other based on that right now. So you absolutely have biases from like the north to the south to the east to the west, right?
Right. And how do we break those down? Outside of conversation and curiosity and breaking down to the reducing the fear, is there any other tricks or that you have up your sleeve in terms of breaking those things down?
No, I think it's experiences. You have to get people exposed to experiences and overcome their curiosity. And I think if you do those things, and then people start looking at things differently. But you can't tell them this is what they should feel. They have to experience it.
Okay, so I love that you went there. So on both sides, how do you get people to do those experiences? And what do you do with people that are reluctant to have those experiences?
You have to inspire them.
Okay, good. That's nice. And educate, inspire, entertain. You got to pull them over there some way, right?
Yep.
Some way you got to pull them over there so that they want it. And then how else do you do this in mass? Like I can see this working, 20 people at a time, but how do we think in thousands at a time?
I mean, I think you have to start with the 20 and the 20 replicate and starts becomes exponential over time, but you can't expect it to do like a big broad wash at one time and expect that's going to have a result,
Yeah.
It's really got to be grassroots and make it contagious and essentially make people move the needle and want to move the needle and champion it.
And thank God you didn't say viral. So yes. Yeah. What's the hardest D&I conversation you've ever had?
I guess if somebody's not really open to talking.
Yeah. Yeah, I think my most difficult is when someone just kept saying yes. They weren't really listening. They're just kind of shaking their head, going, yeah. That's. They weren't open, but they acted like they were open, which was to me even more offensive.
Yeah. Definitely.
So supplier diversity. Do you see that as a push, especially for staffing firms into larger corporate firms? Do you see that as important, and how do you, if so, how do you champion that?
I mean, I do think it's important, but ultimately at the end of the day, like whatever, you have to be able to deliver against the product you're bringing. So you can't just show up and say, I'm Indian and that's why you should hire me. You have to be able to build that service and provide value, right? So it's a bonus, and it's something that should be, all things equal, then it's something they should consider. But at the end of the day, you still have to deliver, right? And to me, that phase one of sort of like getting to the equal opportunity equation that you're talking about, was the first 20 years, like we had to have supplier diversity initiatives, and now it's like beyond. Now I think it's like with staffing specifically, one of the things I'm promoting is let's get beyond diverse spend to diversity hiring, right? So if I'm an Indian guy and I have all Indians working for me, and you're putting your spend through me, is that really diverse? Because it's really focused and concentrated in one population.
That's a good point,
right? And so I think that's kind of the promotion that we're doing right now, is like let's get beyond diversity spend to actually diversity hiring.
I like that. I like that. Again, you're getting representative population, so that you take that from the suppliers into the companies and the employees and who they hire and who they serve, the customers that they serve.
Yeah. So I kind of feel like on some level, if you're really looking at diverse suppliers, you should probably look at their organizational makeup too and make sure they're diverse.
Mm-hmm. Right. And again, that takes it all the way down to the level of, okay, we care so much. We want to actually care about, who are you hiring? Yeah. You're going to help us, and that's going to be a good thing. But how are you structured? Who do you have behind the veil that's going to be helping us? A question that
if you think about it, you're bringing me in because I'm a diverse supplier, right?
Right.
And that's my favorite, if you want to call it a favor, whatever that you're doing for an organization.
Sure.
Well, shouldn't they also be paying that forward and making sure their organization is what they're promising?
Yeah. And again, it's the re-up. Every year you should make sure that that's still happening, so that those contracts, it's part of the contract. It's a part of doing the relationship. Does diverse slates that you put in front of people? So if you're putting a slate of 10 candidates, you're trying to put 10 different types of candidates. Is that? I mean, I'm assuming, of course. Is that purposeful if and when you do that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely make an active effort to do that, but ultimately at the end of the day, they have to have the skills. So if they don't, then we don't put it forward, right? So if it's possible, then we do it. And that's part of like the conscious and bias movement, is saying, take a percentage of your dollars that you're spending towards diversity and use it to build the staff that you want to build, right? And so that might be either internally, like you want to move the population in a certain area, or externally, you invest in schools that are growing the kids to get those skills that you want to hire for in the future and long term.
And the folks that have done this the best, and stories that we've heard, at least in this series, they had some type of critical moment. They had some type of, I'm going to say, a painful moment. There's some type of community outrage or something that kind of happened, and they forced them into change. Looking inward, trauma. Great word. Trauma happened, and then they looked inward, And what most of them have come out of that with is transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think transparency and D&I initiatives, where do you think they exist, coexist?
Do I think they coexist?
Yeah. Do you think they're related in any way, shape, or form?
Oh, absolutely. If you're not having an honest conversation, then you're basically just painting over something and just doing it for the sake of doing it, but not believing what you're doing, right? And then that's not really changing anything.
So can you sniff out people with that as a kind of a backdrop? Can you sniff out people if they're not transparent?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's not a perfect science, but we definitely have things we look at, you know.
I could see that. I could see that being one of the probative questions. Like, if you're really serious about this, okay, well, how are you going to render it? What do you mean, how are you going to render it? Well, how are you going to make it transparent to your customers and your employees, etc.? Well, we don't plan to. Well, then, why are we still talking?
What do you think of the concept of failure to commit?
Oh, well, first of all, I think the path to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So, I would say that there's a whole lot of people that are getting back to fear. That some of it gets in the way, that they think it's a good idea, they want to do it, they don't know how to do it, and if they get halfway down the road, they get scared.
Yeah.
And some of that conflict that I talked about, that all of a sudden you start hiring a bunch of people that are different than you wake up and it's chaos. Like, holy shit, I can't control things anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think that's some of that failure to commit comes from the underpinnings, or fear, uncertainty, chaos, and it could be just good intentions gone awry.
Mm-hmm.
What about you?
I mean, I haven't thought too much of it, but I think it's something that people can look at too, right? If you really are willing to do this, what kind of skin are you going to put in the game to make sure it happens?
Yeah. And you'll get the inevitable question of what is the diminished return. What's the end game? How do we measure this? How do we measure the effectiveness? What do we convey to people? How do we convey it? And at the end of the day, when do we know that we've succeeded? And so you get all those are inevitable questions.
Absolutely.
What question should we're to the end? What question should I have asked you that I didn't ask you?
Let's say we hit this perfect matrix of people that you want in your organization that are truly diverse. Now they're here. How do you keep them?
Great.
Thanks for listening to The Collective Voice. If you or someone you know is interested in a transcript of this podcast or other topics impacting technical recruiting, please visit resources.eteki.com today.